Oh, Florida. It may be the land of a million memes and wild news articles, but to us death metal fans, it is the birthing ground of some of the best death metal ever made, and arguably its birthplace dating back to 1983 with the formation of Mantis by Chuck Schuldiner, Cam Lee, and Rick Ross. Mantis would change their name to Death in 1984, and the rest was history. The Florida death metal explosion of the early 90s created one of the best death metal scenes of all time. There's no debating that. Bands from around the world would travel to Tampa to record their albums at Morrisound Studio. Bands like Cannibal Corpse and Malevolent Creation would relocate to Florida in order to further their careers instead of staying in New York. This video isn't going to focus on bands like Death, Morbid Angel, Deicide, and many others. As great as those bands are, unless you're just getting into death metal, you already know them. Instead, I'm going to be bringing attention to some of the lesser known bands from that scene that I think are also worth your time. Not to be confused with the more prolific Incubus from Louisiana, this Incubus was active from 1986 through 1989 and released a singular demo in 1987. It was a self-titled demo, but later repressings would sometimes retitle it God Dies on His Knees. For what reason, I don't know, but let's just be happy for the repressing since you aren't likely to find an original demo tape. This is commonly considered to be one of the most important demos of all time, especially in the death metal genre. Incubus are rather famous for having Sterling Scarborough and Mike Browning, who would do time in bands like Morbid Angel and Nocturnus, and Gino Marino, who would later be in both Nocturnus and Nocturnus AD. For a death metal demo from 1987, the sound here is not too bad. It's rough and raw, but everything here is audible, bass guitar included. The drums kind of suffer the worst, unfortunately, but that's kind of a minor criticism. You get 3 songs clocking in at just under 11 and a half minutes of pure early Floridian death metal. Musically, this is not too far off from early Morbid Angel and Nocturnus demos, not too surprisingly. It is fast and aggressive with lots of guitar solos similar in sound and style to what Trey Azagthoth of Morbid Angel would become known for, and vocally you get a maniacal and unhinged performance with that early death metal style. Epitaph out of Tampa were active from 1990 to 1992 and were formed by members of bands like Resurrection and Cynic. They released 2 demos, but I generally prefer the first one from 1991. It's got 3 songs clocking in at just under 13 and a half minutes. It may not be as early or as influential as the 87 Incubus demo, but in my opinion, it's far superior in just about every way. The production is very decent since it was recorded at Morrisound Studios. Style-wise, it is a bit similar to like mid-era Death and even some more technical stuff like Atheist and Cynic. I'd even throw in an Obituary comparison, although much, much tighter. And speaking of Obituary, you also get a guest backing vocal appearance by John Tardy on the first track, I Endeavor. This demo is a true fucking gem and one of my favorite demos of all time. They never got around to recording an album, unfortunately, just a second demo with just 2 tracks in 1992. The musicianship here is forward-thinking for 1991 and super tight. Fans of technical death metal are not going to want to miss this. That said, it isn't so technical that fans of more traditional style death metal wouldn't be able to get into. It kind of finds middle ground between the 2 styles. You get some classy guitar solos with a lot of style and character with great tone, similar to that of the great Chuck Schuldiner. It's just brilliant. I can promise you that these 3 tracks will leave you wanting more, which unfortunately you won't really get too much of. That said, do not skip this. Asheron formed in Tampa in 1988 and would eventually move to Pennsylvania and then Ohio. Though fairly well known, I decided to include them in this list since they always kind of seem to be the underdogs as far as death metal history goes. They had numerous setbacks such as lineup changes, relocation, spending a lot of time signed to record labels that put little to no effort into the band, and with poor distribution. After a string of demos between 1989 and 1991, Asheron would release their debut album Rites of the Black Mass in 1992 via German label Turbo Music, a label known for releasing early material by bands like Beherit, Goatlord, and many more. Asheron stood out in the Florida death metal scene just like all the other great bands would do. In my opinion, they often had touches of black metal in their sound, and bassist vocalist Vincent Crowley at the time was a high-ranking member of the Church of Satan. The music was fairly straightforward with lots of great neoclassical sounding guitar solos, creating a cool dichotomy not unlike, Cause of Death by Obituary and pretty much every Vital Remains album. Rites of the Black Mass has a spoken word intro in between each song with the dialogue coming directly out of the Satanic Bible, as far as I know anyways, which, although unique, seemed pointless to some people. Personally, I think it's a cool touch and adds kind of a, obscure atmosphere to the album. You likely know the name Asheron, but check out this album, if you haven't heard it. And, if you like it, be sure to check out the rest of their awesome discography. Death metal and coffee. Nothing like it. Eulogy was formed out of Tampa in 1989 and were initially active until 1996. The band consisted of members from bands like Monstrosity, Brutality, Resurrection, Diabolic, and many more. They never got around to recording a full-length album, but in 1993 would see them release an excellent EP called The Essence. Eulogy had a really ambitious sound, and you could tell that they were looking to add some uniqueness and creativity to their sound with interesting time signatures and female vocal parts for atmosphere. The songs are interesting and well played. This EP is very good, and I think that Eulogy had all the potential to create a masterpiece in the form of a full length, but sadly it just never happened. I have heard rumors that they are currently active, but no new material has been heard since their 1995 demo. Most of the members have stayed active in bands like Pultra Morte and Brutality, and guitarist Jarrett Pritchard currently does work in engineering and producing. Definitely give The Essence a listen for some unique and forward-thinking death metal. If you haven't heard it yet, it'll be a breath of fresh air, I guarantee it. Killing Addiction formed out of Ocala, Florida in 1988. After releasing a killer EP in 1991 called Necrosphere, they would put out their debut full-length Omega Factor in 1993 via cult record label JL America. Despite being from Florida, I never thought that Killing Addiction had too much of a kind of typical Florida sound. I suppose at times I can hear some Chuck Schuldiner-esque guitar tone in some of the riffs, but I think that Omega Factor leans a little more towards what death metal was doing in the East Coast around that time. The vocals are fairly monotone at times, but have that brutal, ultra-low approach that you would hear in the brutal death metal genre. A lot of the riffs are kind of bludgeoning in their simplicity, very primal in nature, but occasionally you would get some kind of semi-technical parts that keep the album interesting and holds your attention. The album has a unique atmosphere, and I think it excels with the kind of slower, mid-pace, crushing grooves. But I also enjoy songs that kind of come out of nowhere, like the Carcass-esque riffing of the song Dehumanized. Fans of stuff like Incantation might be into this with its primal evil sound, but I would also recommend it to fans of bands like Pyrexia and Internal Bleeding. Yet again, another band from Tampa. Brutality are one of the best and probably most underrated. Forming in 1987 from the ashes of thrash band Abomination, Brutality would hone their craft releasing demos and an EP from 1988 to 1993 when they were ready to unleash their masterpiece Screams of Anguish upon the world via Nuclear Blast Records. I mean, really, this is one of the best death metal albums to come out of Florida. I think the only mistake they made was waiting until 93 to release it. I'm sure there was a reason for that, but it needed to come out a year or two earlier as death metal's popularity was slowing down considerably by 1993. I mean, however, had this come out sooner, maybe it wouldn't be the amazing album that it is. Screams of Anguish has the forward-thinking, unique style of something like that Eulogy EP and the virtuosity of bands like Death and Morbid Angel. A lot of the Florida guitarists around this time wanted to be Chuck Schuldiner or Trey Azagthoth, but the Brutality duo of Don Gates and Jay Fernandez was impressive in its own right. The band would try and make up for lost time by releasing a decent follow-up in 1994, but to me it wouldn't top Screams of Anguish, and in fact, they never really came close. But that's okay, because most bands could only dream of writing an album this good. The always death metal hotbed of Tampa would see the formation of Resurrection in the absolutely insane year of 1990. After a couple demos in 91 and 92, Resurrection were ready to record their debut full-length at Morrisound in 92. Embalmed Existence would come out in 1993 via Nuclear Blast Records. As with Brutality, 93 was just not the best year to release your death metal debut. It was similar to the thrash scene of the 80s, with bands releasing their debut after, let's say, 1986. They just didn't have enough time to gain traction to survive the 90s. Embalmed Existence was an excellent meat-and-potatoes Florida death metal album. It had the Morrisound production, Dan Seagrave artwork. It's an excellent piece of death metal, but maybe not quite as good as the Florida heavy hitters who already had 3 or 4 albums out by 93. That said, this album should be in any diehards collection, and it holds up perfectly well to this day. Havoc Mass would form in 1990 out of the town of Brandon, Florida. Most of the members would come from a band called Last Rite, and drummer Curtis Beeson was the original drummer for Nasty Savage. They spent their first 2 years recording demos in 91 and 92, and would release their sole album, Killing the Future, in 1993. This is listed as thrash on the Metal Archives, but I'd argue that this is death thrash, no questions asked, with its gruff vocals, chunky riffs, and double bass drumming. It can sit comfortably next to Ritually Abused by Numbskull, Spectrum of Death by Morbid Saint, and Idolatry from Devastation. Killing the Future has that 1993 Massacre Records awful cover art that sadly did no favors for the band, and I'm sure it was skipped over at many record stores because of it. And I've already said it several times here, but 1993 was not the best year for metal. Sure, the death metal bands of the late 80s and very early 90s were still doing okay, but this was not the best year to release your debut. This is a great example of a great album released at the wrong time and a true underrated gem. They would change their name to Inhuman in 1994 and release an album that same year as a 2-piece with programmed drums, and that would be the last we would hear from these guys. Such a bummer. Phobia formed in 1989 out of Orlando. With most of the band members having no prior experience, it took them some time to record 2 demos in 92 and 93. 1995 saw the release of their first and last full-length album titled Of Hell. Of Hell had all the ingredients needed for a great death metal album. Thrashy riffs and great solos courtesy of guitar duo Ken Barber and Josh Sweeney, a vocal performance with a ton of character from Nick Chevalier, and a great drum performance from a young Tony Loreno, who would go on to play with bands like Nile and Dimmu Borgir. Adding to that, a few other interesting things about this album, like Gene Hoglan playing drums on the last 3 tracks, and Chuck Schuldiner adding vocals and guitar to the last track, and even helping to engineer this thing. Wow. Phobia had what it took to be a great death metal band, but getting your wheels turning in the worst time in the history of death metal was not going to benefit anyone. They also did not have the support of a good record label, but on the plus side, Dutch label Vic Records would repress Of Hell on CD in 2020, keeping the legacy alive. Equinox formed in 1992 out of Mount Plymouth, Florida by Pete Slate, who would also work with Asheron and Incubus around that time, and would later go on to form Druid Lord with Equinox bandmate Tony Black, who also played in Asheron. In 1996, Equinox released their debut full-length Return to Mystery through Greek record label Unisound Records. Their music set them a bit apart from the other Floridian bands, since black metal was a big part of their death metal sound. You could place them next to bands like Rotting Christ, Mortuary Drape, and Mystifier, but a bit more death metal, at the same time. I mean, maybe they are too black metal for this list, but I couldn't leave them off. I usually, will talk about them whenever I get a chance. They would go on to release an EP and a second full-length before moving on to other things. I would have liked more Equinox music, but definitely check out Druid Lord if you haven't. Divine Empire formed in 1997 by Derek Roddy, Jason Blashowitz, and John Paul Soares, all fresh out of Malevolent Creation, and played together on the 1997 album In Cold Blood. In 1998, they would release their debut album Redemption. It doesn't sound too indifferent from what they were doing with Malevolent Creation, but to me it sounds closer to early Deicide. It is fast and ultra brutal, and Blashowitz's vocals remind me of Glenn Benton at times. John Paul Soares' riffing could be compared to the Hoffman brothers, but his tones and soloing style is definitely his own and, adds really cool touches to the album. They would go on to record 3 more albums, with the 2005 album being their last. All are good in my opinion, but Redemption is by far the best of them. Diabolic formed in 1996 in where else but Tampa, Florida. Although they missed out on the glory days of that scene, they gained a decent fan base for themselves. They had a demo out in 97 and their debut full-length Supreme Evil in 98. It really appealed to the Morbid Angel fans with its relentless speed, not unlike Deicide, and its Trey Azagthoth-esque guitar solos, not to mention the Joe Patagno cover art. Vocally, John Hall III has that kind of David Vincent bark, and Antar Lee Coates demonstrates absolute mastery on his drums. You could argue that Diabolic weren't doing, much that hadn't been done before, but I'd say who cares? This is just good death metal regardless. They carried the torch for Florida death metal, and they still do. They went on to record a handful of other albums that have all been good. In fact, they're going strong to this day, even if they had a 10-year gap from 2010 to 2020. If you're bummed on Morbid Angel's more current work and haven't heard Diabolic yet, start with Supreme Evil and work your way through their, entire discography, and you'll be glad you did. Lowbrow formed in 1998 in Brandon, Florida by Alan West, formerly of Obituary and 6 Feet Under, Ben Meyer of Asheron and Nasty Savage fame, and Curtis Beeson, who was also in Nasty Savage and Havoc Mass. That is quite the pedigree right there. Being such veterans of the scene, they wasted no time with a demo and debut full-length Victims at Play, both in 1999. And Lowbrow formed pretty much right after Alan West's departure from 6 Feet Under, and that is exactly the sound you get here. Basically that first 6 Feet Under album and pretty much any Obituary album. But that's totally okay. Alan West has his signature style, and as a fan of early Obituary and 6 Feet Under, I'm right at home here. The band name, lack of a strong record label, and cover art for Victims at Play literally did them no favors, and a band like this certainly deserved better. But for fans of the type of stuff that I named, this might just be one of your new favorite albums. Also check out the awesome bass work of Scott Carino. Dude is arguably the MVP of this album. Internos Sign formed in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1997 by Jared Anderson and a few other Ohio area musicians. And their debut demo was released in that same year. Anderson would relocate to Tampa and kept the Internos Sign name. In 2002, he would release his sole full-length album, The Book of Lambs, after his stint as bassist and vocalist in Morbid Angel from 2001 to 2002. He would also be in Hate Eternal from 98 to 2003, playing bass and providing backing vocals. For the Book of Lambs album, he would do the vocals, bass, and guitars by himself, with Eric Rutan of Hate Eternal playing the solos, and both Derek Roddy and Tony Loreno on drums. The album would be released via Dutch label Hammerheart Records, and is now considered quite a cult classic. The songs are not far removed from what Hate Eternal were doing, and maybe even Cannibal Corpse around that time, with a fast and technical sound. This may not be for everyone, but I think it's a masterpiece. Jared Anderson would pass away at the young age of 30 in 2006. R.I.P., sir.